Greetings and welcome to this, our first class on the book of Revelation. We're calling it Revelation, subtitle Apocalypse as Hope. And I mean it. This is a book of hope. If you have been around a bit, you may know that we went through this about 3 years ago, and those who participated really seemed to enjoy it and also learn a lot from this new old perspective. I'll say new old in that it's new to some people, and it's new maybe to even the majority of North American Christians, as the views on this book have been so dominated by some more modern, contemporary understandings of it. However, what I'm presenting is not new, really. It's old. It is a perspective shared by the first readers of this book. And to get at that, we're going to have to go back into history. And so, whether you've been here with us before or coming through again fresh, or sorry, not again fresh, but coming through fresh as for the first time, I hope that you will engage the lessons, at least with your mind and your heart. And also, if you like, you can write into us, our church. I'm the pastor of a church called Northwood Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. My email is heath@indncc.org. Anyway, moving on to the first slide. Before we dive in, something like a disclaimer, I suppose, I would like to acknowledge that the book of Revelation can stir up strong feelings and very specific interpretive approaches. Sometimes people have approaches that are idiosyncratic to their very selves. And with so many unique perspectives, it's hard sometimes to teach a lesson like this without evoking strong responses. I am personally aware of one church community that has become very strained because its members cannot arrive at a shared understanding of Bible prophecy. That's just one of countless stories. This being said, I expect that we will share different opinions and approaches to these topics. So from the onset, we should commit to treat one another with respect. And I don't expect that we will have problems in this regard. However, I still think it should be said. And if you feel some deep questions or passion stirring in relation to some of the things said here, let's find opportunities to voice those, but also not to take the class over, I suppose. I definitely have somewhere I want to take us. And maybe we'll get to the end and you'll still say no. But let's get to the end. And I don't mean just the end of this class, I mean the end of the series too. And we'll have discussion along the way about diverse opinions. The book of Revelation has a reputation, doesn't it? Here's a picture that encapsulates something of that revelation: calamity, death, throes of destruction, but then little glimpses of life. You've got the angel up in the picture that you may be looking at here, holding a crown. So hope is on the way, help is on the way. However, in the meantime, dragons and beasts, multi-headed monsters, locusts the size of horses, my goodness, great battles so ferocious that the blood of the slain rises as high as the horses' chins. Just imagine the volume and maybe the plausibility of that occurring. However, more on that later. These are truly terrible scenes that are described here. Terrible to behold, and they're over the top with violence, calamity, punctuated by scenes of splendor and great beauty. And those contrasts we'll talk about too. Angelic hosts singing praises to God. Gold and light flood the city, the holy city of God, where we find Jesus enthroned. It's a place where all seems to be set right. All of the nations, in fact, flood through the holy city's wide open gates so that they may be reconciled, so that death and sin will be no more. That's the image at the end of this book. But these are scenes of both terror and joy, and they're held in contrast for a purpose. And we'll talk more about that as we get through this book. And the book of Revelation has consequently incited both of these responses, both terror and joy. And both of them in me as a person. I embody these polarities in relation to this book. Maybe we each have a story about this book in relation to this book. It's possible that you're hearing about it for the first time, or maybe you have a vague idea of what it is and how it functions in popular culture, but maybe this is your first time really studying it. However, many of us have a story in relation to this book in terms of interacting. Maybe we were part of other Bible studies, or maybe you saw some of the Left Behind movies growing up or read the books. It's been quite a polarizing book, to say the least. And some of us absolutely love it, and some find it terrifying and avoid it at all costs. Still, others find it more confusing than anything. And as a pastor, I've been met with a wide range of reactions to the book through the years. I've been met with wide eyed individuals who've volunteered their opinions about the book, about Bible prophecy, and where we might be on a timeline. But just as often, I've been met with people who seem genuinely troubled by the book, troubled that it's included in our canon, and troubled that people seem to take it as prescriptive, as something that prescribes how we ought to be right here, right now, which in a way it does, but maybe not in the way that they're thinking. But these are sincere Christians who find the imagery and the violence of Revelation troubling. I've known more than a few. And I have both of these individuals in me. I've been both of these individuals in my time, in my life. And I've approached this book with fascination and terror, and more recently, fascination and hope, as will unfold. So take a moment. If you're watching this, pause, think about it, write it down, maybe if that's the way you work. Or if you're here in the class with me, take a moment to tell our own revelation stories. I'm going to take a pause here if for those who are listening in on the class live with me in the room. And we're going to talk about that. In the meantime, I won't subject you to cloudy recordings of people in an open room. So take a moment to tell your own revelation story, if at least to yourself, if not to people who are in the room with you. I'll assume that you just flushed it out and have it fresh, ready to tell, or have already told it. And here's mine. I had thought I was raised in a church that was very preoccupied by the end times, and now I think that it was only as preoccupied as any other Protestant evangelical congregation. It seemed all of the time and in the air, and yet I've since found that this is a fairly common experience for those raised in similar type churches of similar demographic, which is to say, we basically thought of the book of Revelation as a book that forecast the future, and that the overall schema was pretty well settled. Basically, it was the Left Behind style dispensationalist theology that we'll cover all about as we roll along. So if words like dispensationalist are new to you, or if maybe you're unfamiliar with the Left Behind, that's okay. We'll be covering where those fit in the history of this book called Revelation. As I was saying, I used to think that my church was very preoccupied with the end times, and perhaps they were, but I now realize that it was my father who was and is the most fixated on these things. And I'll here add also kind of par for the course in some communities. My dad is not the only one. I love my dad. He still thinks very similarly along these lines, and I don't think he would be offended. Actually, I know he would not be offended at my having say so. In fact, he would like to come up to bat for himself and say, there is another way, and you are well familiar with that way. Love you, Dad. But we're going to talk about where I've arrived through study, and also where maybe many others have found themselves on the other side of taking a very close look at this book, a way that cuts against the grain of some common notions. But growing up, for me, the end of the days were always just around the corner. My father believed that this would occur before I died, but before I died, he died, we died. We would need to go through great suffering. The Christians would, broadly, before we were saved and collected to live with God away from the tribulations of this earth. This is called a post-tribulation rapture theology. Again, we'll go over these as we proceed. Next week, in fact. No, 2 weeks from now. But in the meantime, I waited and I prepared for the end of the world. Watched the news with rapt interest, looking for the signs of the end times, trying to determine just where we were on the eschatological timeline. And here we'll take a pause to go over a term, eschatology. That is a fancy word that means doctrines pertaining to the culmination of God's plans, or the end times, as some will insist. It's about how God will work a transformation at the end of this age into what's next. Eschatology. I was told in my undergrad that one way to remember it is it's a good word to use when you smack your thumb with a hammer, should you ever do so, in lieu of some probably more suitable swear word, but maybe it gets the job done. Eschatology. All this to say, this terrified me as a child. The themes that are hanging here in the air. I was told that, and I sincerely believed, that very soon my family would suffer and endure great persecution because of our faith. I was told that we would need to head for the hills when the signs of the times indicated that we were at nearly Earth's end, Earth's terminus. I have two stories to illustrate this. One is I became aware at some point that my father was placing prices in Alaska to move there without my mom knowing, or really anybody. He was doing this because he had heard that we don't pay property taxes in Alaska, and he thought that in this end times scenario, the best place to wait things out and maybe some sort of survivalist comfort would be to go to Alaska, buy a little plot of land somewhere off the grid, as they say, and live off the fat of the land and wait out things so that we could minimize the risk to ourselves. And when my mother found this out, she told him that he could move to Alaska, but the kids were staying in Indiana. And so that talk just sort of died down. But tell it to give you an image into the sort of pace of my life, or the tone of my life. Tone meaning, if you had to, it resonated with fear, pending calamity, pending violence, and aimed at us. Um, in in any way, that was the way it was. Similarly, when the year 2000 came, you may remember there was a lot of stuff in the news about how all of the computers would glitch, and then all of a sudden we'd find ourselves in some form of what they say apocalyptic scenario. As an aside, that word apocalypse needs to be rectified and re-understood, as we will throughout this lesson. It does not mean the end of the world, as it's often portrayed or described. However, just to use it as a shorthand for the end of the world, as people often do, that's what we thought was happening around the year 2000. And so our months leading up to that were occupied with not only trying to get the biblical prophecy right and understanding it, but uh, setting aside canned goods and other things for our survival. Flashlights, I don't remember all the stuff. I would have been about 15 at the time, but I do remember we bought a whole new cabinet to store dry goods for this time. And this scared me. It all left me terrified, as you see I've written here. I was told that in the end, all would be good, but the build up until that end, the wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes, natural disasters, violence and bloodshed. I can remember going to bed after these evening devotions, clutching my I can remember going to my bed after evening devotions, clutching my children's Bible close to my chest, crying and praying, begging Jesus not to come back in my lifetime. After all, I wanted to enjoy the good things I had expected to enjoy when I grew up. I wanted to get married, have kids, grow old. So I'd plead with the good Lord to delay the return. But I couldn't live that way forever, at least not all of the time. So I took my fears and anxiety about Revelation and Bible prophecy, and I more or less tabled them. I set them aside as something to worry about another time. I avoided the book of Revelation, except for the first 3 chapters, which deal primarily with the churches in Asia Minor. But overall, I avoided it, assuming the book to be either too incomprehensible for my understanding or too stressful to seriously consider. Throughout my pastorate, I have learned that my feelings are by no means unique or rare. If you're hearing this thinking, boy, that kid really had it bad, I've met many Christians who are confused and or scared by the book of Revelation who could share similar stories that echo with mine. And for that reason, many have either doubled down and found ways of explaining to themselves the reasons for the violence and the fear, or they've just jettisoned the whole thing. And I think both are bad approaches. I've also met perhaps just as many, though, who are downright enthused by the whole thing from the jump, especially over questions as to where we are on the prophetic timeline. For much of my time as pastor, I didn't really know what to say or how to contribute to these conversations on account of my own baggage. So I largely avoided the conversation. I felt a bit uneasy about this, and am a pastor after all, but I just didn't know how to engage the topics. I was carrying baggage and largely unable to help others with their own, except to commiserate. There's my story. Now, broad goals for the study, or one broad goal. If I can help in any way, my goal for the study and our time together is to teach you what I've learned since then about the book of Revelation, how it was originally understood, which is different from what I've been describing, how it has been read through the centuries, and also how we can access it today. Ultimately, I want you to understand, and I hope to demonstrate, how this book is not a book of terror, but is rather a book that calls us to a radical hope. If you don't believe me, stay tuned. I think we may all get there together. This will be a study in 3 parts. Next week, we'll begin to talk about apocalyptic literature and Jewish history. Turns out this is a genre within Jewish literature that has been lost to time, and understanding how to read it can only be obtained. We can only get there if you understand how it was originally read and why it was written in the way that it was. Once we understand that, we will move into the book of Revelation itself, which will occupy the lion's share of the lessons. There's 19 lessons in total. So we'll be going on through the summer until the very, very early fall. The last class I have scheduled for September the 8th. And at the end, though, before we get to there, we will talk about Revelation in the centuries after its writing, how it's been understood. And it's not always been the way it is today, even. There have been other times and moments in history where it was appropriated or misappropriated to suit the times and the people involved, and we will get into that. But to summarize each 3 of these parts a little bit more so, part 1, the very beginning of our lessons, we will talk about apocalypse in Jewish history. When the term was first used in the Bible, it meant something quite different than what it means today when people use it. We get the word from its biblical Greek translation, apocalypse, which means quite literally disclosure. An apocalypse is an act of disclosure, an unveiling, pulling back the curtain to see what's behind it, which is why the book is named Revelation in our language. It reveals. It reveals something about God and God's purposes. The word apocalypse has been so misappropriated and ill-used to mean the end of the earth with calamity and everything else. Its original meaning has been lost. So there's an important point here. In the Bible, apocalypse does not mean the end. The reason we believe that it does mean the end is because we have become convinced that Bible prophecy forecasts the end of the world, a point I will contest throughout this study. But the apocalyptic prophetic traditions in the Hebrew Bible are not concerned with the end of days. And this would be the Bible that Jesus would read and would draw his own ideas about apocalypse and apocalyptic understanding. So Jesus, not concerned with the end of days, rather they were concerned with the goings-ons of their own time and day when they were written. The writers of these works would describe the ways things were in the world with all of its violence, suffering, and injustice. Then they would write in powerfully descriptive and poetic language of how God felt about the way of things. Sometimes they would then describe a hopeful vision for a possible future should the people and nations find their way to repent and change their ways. The prophets, though, were unwilling to accept the status quo, which is often the main point. Let's show the world through dramatic portrayals of pictures and images, some incredulous to consider if you're trying to think that they may exist in real time, in real anatomy of real creatures with lions' heads and wings and such things, as you may be seeing here in the picture in the slide. But the purpose of these pictures wasn't to describe literal events, but to give us emotive feelings, to evoke from us feelings about how God may feel about the way that the world is going. As the apocalyptic traditions developed, the writers began to frame their struggles in terms of cosmic conflict between the forces of good and of evil. They would write in such a way as to give form and shape to these struggles. The evil empires of the day are described as wild beasts and in other colorful ways, other descriptions. Sometimes the evil empire under consideration was Egypt, other times Persia, but the name that stuck as a stand in for all imperialistic ways, all things really broken with human society, was Babylon, a great empire, precursor to the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great, the Persians, and to the Roman Empire, of course, in Jesus' day. The writer of Revelation drew from these earlier prophetic writings. So what we're reading in ways echoes earlier writings, which is why sometimes people not acknowledging that these works are in conversation with one another will say, hey, look, they are saying the same thing, meaning they saw the same thing from two very different perspectives, when rather that's not the way it worked. The writer of the book of Revelation, who we call John, was pulling from centuries old traditions and stories and images as I guess, a stock collection of what he would draw from for us to now access. For example, the seraphs in the throne room mentioned by the prophet in Isaiah 6 are echoed, if not in some ways mirrored, in the description of the heavenly throne room in Revelation chapter 4. So all this to say, and you hear me by now, I think that the book of Revelation comes out of a larger prophetic tradition that, at the time of its writing, was already more than half a century old. After we've done with the history of apocalyptic literature, which will take us next week, we will talk about the book of Revelation itself. In the second part of our class, we'll spend several weeks going over the book. We'll consider its authorship, its immediate context, and the actual content of the book. We'll discuss what this meant for its original readers and how the imagery and metaphors found there pertain to the events transpiring around them at the time of its writing. What I hope you'll come to see is that the images and descriptions found in Revelation described events that had already transpired in history, as well as events transpiring in their present. Does the book tell the future, as many assume? Well, no spoilers. We'll cross that bridge when it comes, but you may already have an idea as to how I think. An idea as to how I think, the way I think being the way that has been formed through study. It doesn't come out of nowhere. I hope I will share more than my humble opinion, but a consensus of good biblical scholarship. Part 3, we'll talk about Revelation through the centuries. And here we'll come back around to those doctrines and theologies that are most dominant even today, that maybe many of you have been influenced by, have heard, or have embedded in you in some way. So we'll consider Revelation through the centuries since its writing and the impacts it has made on our culture and the cultures previous. We'll drop into various times in history to learn how the book of Revelation was interpreted and utilized in Christian communities in the past. For example, what did people see in Revelation during the bubonic plague or immediately following a natural disaster? During the COVID-19 pandemic, I noticed that there were many echoes to how people approached Revelation afresh that seemed to mirror much of the way it was handled and understood during the times of the bubonic plague. I wonder why. Maybe there's something inherent in human nature that looks for certain things in certain places. More on that later. But I think we'll discover that it is ours, that our understanding and our generation is not the first generation to believe that the book of Revelation is all about their time, their place, and where they are in history. And a story just comes to mind right now as I record this. Maybe I'll leave it in. Where in a camp meeting, whole revival, the preacher, an old fella, probably 70, southern accent. He's just a good old boy, as they say. And he said emphatically, my grandfather believed that Jesus was coming back in his lifetime, and my father believed that Jesus was coming back in his lifetime, and I believe that Jesus is coming back in my lifetime. And I don't think he went on to say, and my children will believe, and my grandchildren will believe. But I just share that to say that everyone thinks that the events in it are all about them. There may be something about us. We'll, again, talk about that as we go. More on that to come. In the meantime, before we conclude here, I'll just go over our pending schedule. I have here mapped out through July 7th, where we'll take a week off during the week of July 4th. However, um, you can begin to read ahead. That would be what I'd encourage. Um, as you look at these lessons, um, consider that uh, there's a lot of reading. You want to be familiar with the book of Revelation, and so I would encourage you to read through it, if not for the umpteenth time, maybe for the first time if you've never really sat down with it. And please don't be alarmed. As you read things that trouble you, realize that I believe they are intended to trouble us in ways that lead to life, that stir us up towards life giving directions, not to bowl us over in fear. So, I guess content warning as you read it. It is quite a striking book and sometimes disturbing, but please read it, Revelation. And that way, when we hit the actual text here in a few weeks, you will be ready. Next week, we will be having our second class on Tuesday, May the 5th, 2026, 6:30 at the library at Northwood Christian Church, 4550 Central Avenue, Indianapolis, Indiana. Our topic will be Apocalypse in Jewish Literature. And lastly, I just would like to cite some of the sources that I've used and drawn most heavily from. You can take a screenshot of this if you're looking at it. Um, and you can find these books online. Some of them you can find in libraries. You can find them also at the Christian Theological Seminary Library here in Indianapolis. And you can call them up to find out what it takes to gain public access to those things. Or if you're interested, just ask me. I might be able to lend you a copy. I've already done the research and I've gone through them and I do reference them, but I think I also would feel comfortable lending some of these out for those who are wanting to take a deeper dive. However, these are some things you might read. Until next time, peace, and I hope that you have a wonderful week in between.